and bring fortitude to the families of all of the victims. Dear God, bring down your guardian angels right this minute to the rescue workers and the medical personnel who are working around the clock to try to save lives and to try those who are finding lives. Dear God, we need your help. Our hearts and prayers also go out to members of our own Senate family who are feeling this in a very deep and personal way. Our two colleagues from New York who are in the city this evening, as well as to our senators from Connecticut and New Jersey and what they feel. To the senators from Virginia and to my own colleague from Maryland, we lost people at the Pentagon. Our minds are seared today with images we can still scarcely comprehend. For me, one of the most terrible of those images was the sight of thick smoke over Arlington Cemetery. I couldn't believe it. The graves in that hallowed ground remind us that Americans have faced great evil before, and you know what? We've defeated it. We are united in our resolve to do it again. The question I think all of us are facing is, why are good, innocent people allowed to suffer? This question is as old as humanity. It was the cry of Job, and it's the question that haunts us today. I don't know the answer, but I want to share with you a passage from the book of Job. Job says this: "The thing which I feared greatly has come upon me. That which I was afraid has come to me. Today, what we have feared has come to our land." But again, like Job, we know that the grace of God can lead us to do the right thing. We ask God for the courage and the wisdom to respond rightly. I believe that God was with the victims of yesterday's attack. I believe God was with them in their hour of travail, fear, and death. I believe He is here with all of those who grieve and all those who suffer with these so many good and innocent people. And I believe He will be with us in our search for answers and justice. That's my prayer this evening. We're not going to sacrifice our ideals in the pursuit of the monsters who attacked us. We're not going to compromise our principles for which so many Americans fought and died. But we will root out those who committed this atrocity. We will pursue justice. And with God's grace, we're going to move forward. We're going to be a stronger nation and a better people than before. So let's again ask for God's mercy. Let's ask for God's forgiveness upon those who did this terrible deed, and that they might repent and turn to a different life. And let us then try to find what is the good and righteous thing to do. God bless you, and God bless America.
As we watch this prayer vigil at the United States Capitol for members of Congress and their spouses, I'm Judy Woodruff in Washington. I'm going to say goodnight for now, but in just a moment, Wolf Blitzer, Greta Van Susteren will be with us as our coverage continues of the attack on America.
Tonight, America under attack. How could it happen? 4 airliners take off from 3 airports within a 12-minute span. All have hijackers aboard.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
3 planes are used for suicide attacks. 1 does not find its objective. We'll take a close look at just what happened aboard those planes. Meticulous planning, plenty of resources, deadly will. Who did it? How did they do it? And why? We'll speak live with Senators John McCain and Richard Shelby, former New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, and other top intelligence and law enforcement authorities. And as investigators begin casting their net, we'll go live to our CNN correspondents on the scene to find out what happens next.
Blitzer reporting tonight from Washington. Behind me, the White House, the Washington Monument, and a short distance away, just across the Potomac River, the Pentagon, symbols of a country which has now come under attack.
And I'm Greta Van Susteren. On this day after, how did it happen? How could it have happened? We'll do our best to answer those two questions.
For those of you who are just joining us, here's a quick update on the developments at this hour. Another building adjacent to New York's World Trade Center has partially collapsed. The 54-story One Liberty Plaza building was the new home of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. Rescue workers combing the wreckage of the Trade Center's twin towers were evacuated. Earlier, they had pulled 9 people alive from the rubble. At the Pentagon, parts of which are still smoldering, firefighters showed their courage and their colors, and the president paid a visit.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives.
Boston, where 2 of the hijacked flights originated, is a focus of the investigation. Police and FBI agents swarmed a downtown hotel, and a car containing suspicious materials was impounded at Logan Airport. A number of people have been taken into custody, several of them in Florida, where authorities zeroed in on aviation schools and a home where one of the suspected hijackers may have lived. For more on the developments in Boston, let's go to CNN's Boston Bureau Chief Bill Delaney. Bill, tell us what we know right now.
Well, Wolf, to give you an idea of the sheer dimensions of the investigations here, 150 state police detectives assigned to investigate Logan Airport alone, among hundreds of FBI, state, and local police who are fanning out for whatever evidence they can garner and talking now to people who have been taken into custody. 3 people taken into custody at Boston's Westin Copley Hotel today in extraordinary scenes in Copley Square in the heart of Boston. Usually a place people sit around and look at fountains and pigeons. Today, FBI SWAT teams, heavily armed with machine guns, storming into the Westin Copley Hotel where they took into custody 3 men. Now, FBI Director Robert Mueller himself being careful to point out that these were not arrests. These men have been brought in for questioning, for possible links, for possible information as sources to try to understand who committed the hijackings that left Boston, the 2 planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. Now, after the arrests, bomb-sniffing dogs made what authorities call a hit in the Boston Westin Hotel. It was at that point that the hotel and a nearby shopping mall were evacuated, adding thousands into an already extraordinary scene in Copley Square, where thousands of onlookers had already gathered. Now thousands came out, evacuated from those hotels in mostly calm scenes. Now it's being widely reported and sourced as well by CNN sources that the hijackers who came to Boston came from 2 places, from 2 directions. One team from Canada. Now a car at Portland International Airport has become a focus for state police there. They believe that was a car used by at least one of the hijackers. Another car is here in Boston. Now, this was taken into custody at Central Parking here yesterday. It's now at an FBI processing center near Boston, and this a very important piece of evidence, apparently, indeed. Arabic language flight training manuals reportedly found in that car, and CNN's Mike Betcher reporting earlier that the car was registered to 2 Arabs. Back to you, Wolf.
Well, Delaney, very briefly, do we know when Boston's Logan Airport will reopen?
Closed indefinitely while officials here try to work with those FAA guidelines that have been imposed on airports around the country. It's closed indefinitely.
Okay, Bill Delaney in Boston, thank you very much. Greta?
The investigation into the attacks is literally spanning the globe, with hundreds of agents and law enforcement agencies involved and new leads developing by the hour. For a look at the big picture, let's go now to CNN's justice correspondent Kelly Arena in Washington. Kelly, give me an idea, big picture, how many people are involved in this investigation?
The FBI says they have 4,000 special agents, 3,000 support personnel. That's not to mention the hundreds of people that work in the FBI labs working on this investigation around the nation. And they are pursuing, at last count, more than 2,000 leads.
Now, when you talk about this investigation, a number of crime scenes. You've got Boston, you've got Newark, you've got Pennsylvania. Let me go through the different crime scenes and tell me what's going on. In Boston, what kind of investigation are they doing at the airport?
Well, at all of those locations, Greta, what the FBI has done, has identified the takeoff sites, not only the airports themselves, but the surrounding areas, and then the crash sites as crime scenes. And at those locations, what they're doing is they're dusting for fingerprints. They are going through passenger manifests, rental car records. They're looking at telephone logs, videotape from parking garages, looking at payphone videotapes. And we were even told by some law enforcement sources that investigators in Florida, for example, are going through neighborhoods and restaurants showing people pictures of suspected hijackers. So they're really pounding the pavement and trying to gather as much forensic evidence as possible.
And the crash site in Pennsylvania, is that getting closer examination? Because at least the plane at least has a chance of more parts there.
Well, exactly. I mean, in Pennsylvania, that was the only plane that went into the ground instead of into a building, so they have a much better chance of getting at it and really trying to get some information. Plus, law enforcement sources also tell CNN that the transponder on that plane was open for a period on that flight, so they may have information, at least air traffic control may have information directly from the cockpit on that flight. And as you know, Greta, we also have people who have called from not only the Pennsylvania flight but others, but specifically from Pennsylvania. We've heard from family members that have outlined the tragedy that went on that flight.
Kelly Arena, thank you for joining me tonight. Wolf?
World Trade Center and the Pentagon, quote, acts of war, and officials now say the White House itself was an intended target. Let's go live to CNN senior White House correspondent John King. So obviously at the White House. John, tell us what we know about that.
Well, Wolf, to put this new information in context, let's think back to yesterday morning when the first pictures were being shown of those planes hitting the World Trade Center. We saw an evacuation here at the White House. CNN is also told now by sources that Vice President Dick Cheney, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, other top White House officials were ushered out of their offices to a command and control bunker, a fortified command and control bunker deep beneath the White House grounds here. Why? Administration officials now saying that that plane that came across the Potomac River caused so much damage across the river at the Pentagon. Its initial target, we are now told, might not have been the Pentagon.
We have real and credible information that the airplane that landed at the Pentagon was originally intended to hit the White House.
Can you tell us about the nature of that evidence?
No, of course I cannot. Any questions relating to how we have obtained any of this information, sources and methods, I will of course not answer.
Why it changed course, why it went to the Pentagon and not the White House?
We really do not know the answer to that.
Administration officials also saying not just the White House, but in their view, they also believe that Air Force One, the president's jet, was a target for the terrorists. That, they say, the reason the president did not fly directly back to Washington from Sarasota, Florida. You will remember he stopped first at a military installation in Louisiana, then a military installation in Nebraska. Only then did the president return to Washington with an extraordinary fighter escort visible to those flying aboard Air Force One. The administration saying it believed Air Force One was a target as well. Some sources even saying they believe that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh was planning to turn south and bank its way toward Washington and, if possible, emphasis on if possible, collide with Air Force One as the president was returning to Washington. Wolf.
John, pretty amazing stuff. The president did meet with his national security team once again today. Do we know anything at all about a timetable for a possible U.S. military response?
We know nothing specific about a timetable except the public words of the president and the defense secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, both saying to be patient, that fighting terrorism will not come in a day or two. But we do know, Wolf, from sources familiar with those discussions, the president met twice with his national security team today, and we are told that among the items discussed were were possible U.S. military options. We're told, though, these discussions are in their earliest stages. The priority right now for the administration, building broad diplomatic support. The president spoke today to a half-dozen international leaders, including the presidents of China and Russia, and the administration very much welcoming NATO's statement that these terrorist attacks on the United States, in the view of NATO, are attacks on the NATO alliance. So the president promising there will be consequences to this, but also saying it might take some time.
John King at the White House, thank you very much. Back to you, Greta.
New information, Wolf, is emerging about what happened aboard those 4 hijacked planes before they were brought down. Information which may shed light on what the passengers and the crew were doing, and may help reveal who carried out the attacks and why. More from CNN's Miles O'Brien.
Nothing seemed amiss when American Airlines Flight 11 left the runway in Boston Tuesday morning. The 767-200 was about half full, toting 81 passengers, a cockpit crew of 2, and 9 flight attendants to the opposite coast. The captain likely planned for a 5-hour flight, so there was roughly 8,500 gallons of jet fuel in its 3 tanks. FAA radars tracked the airliner as it followed the flight plan. But then, about 20 minutes into the flight, somewhere over upstate New York, it turned sharply to the south. Flight 11 was hijacked, apparently by knife-wielding men. Airline pilots are trained to handle such situations by keeping calm, complying with requests, and, if possible, dialing in an emergency 4-digit code on a device called a transponder. It transmits crucial flight data to air traffic controllers. The action takes seconds, but it appears no such code was entered. But in the cabin, a frantic flight attendant managed to use a phone to call American Airlines Command Center in Dallas. She reported the trouble, and according to the Christian Science Monitor, a pilot apparently keyed the microphone, transmitting a cockpit conversation. The hijackers could be heard saying, "We have more planes, we have more planes." Radio transmissions like this would have been recorded on the ground by the FAA.
The police have identified 5 suspects that they believe were involved with this terrorist act, and 2 of whom may be brothers, apparently, reportedly. 2 of whom, 2 others, may have flown in from Portland and originated in Canada.
About 5 minutes before Flight 11 started heading south, another 767, United Flight 175, left Boston, also for Los Angeles, 65 souls aboard. 15 minutes after becoming airborne, it veered off course. One passenger made 2 calls to his father. In one exchange, he said a flight attendant was stabbed. In the second call, he told his dad the plane was going down.
They knew not to carry guns on the airplane. If they fired off a bullet, I mean, they could have had explosive decompression on the aircraft. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what their mission was, obviously.
We know what happened next. The 767 struck and ultimately leveled the World Trade Center's Twin Towers.
I know pilots. No, if you're going to die, you're not going to fly in a World Trade Center to do it. Yeah, there would be a struggle, major struggle.
By 8:20, the third hijacked flight, American Flight 77, a 757, left Dulles Airport outside Washington, again bound for Los Angeles with 66 people on board. Radar tracking information on this flight obtained by CNN seems to indicate the transponder was turned off, which would have made it tougher to see on radar. We do know this: an hour and 20 minutes after departure, it plowed into the Pentagon. On board was Barbara Olson, a well-known attorney and frequent CNN legal commentator. Huddled in the back of the plane, Olson called her husband twice from her cell phone. She described the frantic scene.
She said that they were armed with knives and box cutters, cardboard cutters.
Even as the focus shifted to the nation's capital, a fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, bound for San Francisco out of Newark, takes a sudden 180-degree turn near Cleveland. More than one of the 38 passengers called their families to offer final goodbyes.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And then the phone went dead.
The 757 began homing in on the Washington area, its target unknown. But this flight did not make it that far. It crashed into a cornfield in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Was there a struggle in this cockpit? The military denies it was shot down. Pilots assessing this horrific sequence of events to a person believe the hijackers were in control of the 3 planes that hit their targets and that they must have been well schooled in aviation.
No, these people were well qualified on the airplane. They knew the systems, they knew the navigation, and they knew the flight management system, the computers, and they knew navigation. I mean, they went from Boston and right down to New York. I mean, they had to know which way to turn.
Miles O'Brien, CNN.
And with investigators turning much of their attention to Boston, let's turn now to Boston Herald reporter Jonathan Wells, who's been tracking the hijacking probe. He joins us, as we just saw, from our Boston bureau. Jonathan, what do we know about how these hijackers managed to board these 2 planes at Logan Airport in Boston?
Well, that part of the story is really yet to come out, how they actually got on the planes, other than apparently their purchase of 7 of the tickets that were used for the 2 flights were purchased with a credit card, a common credit card, which helped the FBI detain 3 individuals at the Westin Hotel today in Boston who are apparently associates of the hijackers. But how they actually get on the plane, the mechanics of that, I don't know.
And what do you know, if anything, about their whereabouts just before they got to Boston? Had they been in Boston for some time, or did they get there only just before the flights?
Well, here's what we understand. At least 2 of the hijackers apparently came down from Canada, we believe through Nova Scotia, boarded a ferry to Maine. From Maine, either getting off at Bar Harbor or Portland, Maine. They then eventually ended up on a flight to Boston. Now, there apparently may be other hijackers that entered through Canada by a different route, possibly by car. Overall, what we've learned is that a terrorist cell was apparently operating in Massachusetts, had its members traveling to Canada at various times, it appears, had been operating in Massachusetts for some time leading up to this. We've heard mention of Springfield and Western Mass as a post for some of these people. And essentially, they were able to hatch this plot in Massachusetts to some extent and use Massachusetts as a staging area for the attack on New York.
Jonathan Wells of the Boston Herald, thank you very much for joining us. And there is a widespread belief that yesterday's attack succeeded because of major security and intelligence failures. Joining us now, the former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, Larry Johnson, he's a former State Department counterterrorism official, and Senator Richard Shelby, he's the ranking Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Senator Shelby, tell us, first of all, what do we know right now? What do you know right now about who may have been responsible for these attacks?
Well, this investigation, as you know, is ongoing. I was in a briefing with the Attorney General and the FBI Director earlier this afternoon. I won't comment on that. But I can tell you, Wolf, I said last night, I've said it again today, there are certain parallels, I believe, between what happened yesterday in some sense with what happened to our embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Think of the timing. The first thing that came to my mind was the parallel between the precise timings of these bombings. In this case, it was the airplanes, but timing's important. Timing's always been important to Osama bin Laden and his group. Now, was it Osama bin Laden, or was it some similar cells? We'll wait for the investigation. I got a belief it's linked.
Director Woolsey, a lot of people say that the signature of Osama bin Laden is all over these attacks. Are you ready to draw that conclusion?
It may be all over these attacks, and I think that might make us a bit suspicious that something else may be up. Certainly, bin Laden may well have been deeply involved and may have been the operational figure and his people in this, but that doesn't mean that he acted alone. When I see bin Laden issuing fatwas, religious edicts, putting out videotapes, issuing poems, having his subordinates talk about how they're taking part in terrorism against the United States, I begin to think that maybe we're supposed to focus solely on bin Laden, and there might be something else in train. My suspicion, it's no more than that at this point, is that there could be some government action involved together with bin Laden or a major terrorist group, and one strong suspect there, I think, would be the government of Iraq.
Larry Johnson, the government of Iraq sponsoring this act of terrorism, is that your sense as well?
No, I think that's highly unlikely for several reasons. Principally, Iraq right now has been winning the political battle against the United States in the effort to lift sanctions. Secondly, the only recorded terrorist attack we have by Iraq against the United States was the attempt in February of 1993 to kill then former President George Bush Sr. Saddam is a lot of things, but he's not crazy. And the motivations for him at this point to launch an attack that's not just killing Americans, but has probably killed people from as many as 40 different nations in the World Trade Center, which would turn the world against him at a time when he's been making progress in the United Nations and getting sanctions lifted. I think, we should not ascribe to him that kind of idiocy.
So let me just move on to Senator Shelby, Larry Johnson, but before I do, very, very quickly, if it's not Iraq, is it your sense it is just Osama bin Laden?
The only person over the last 8 years, the one that we know for sure that has killed the majority of Americans in terrorist attacks is Osama bin Laden and groups linked to him. And that's not a matter of opinion now. We have that as a result of the U.S. Embassy bombing trials from East Africa earlier this year. Moreover, and one final point, in that trial, evidence emerged that demonstrated that Osama bin Laden had had prior meetings and contacts with Imad Mughniyeh, the Hezbollah chief who was involved with the bombing of the Marine barracks, bombings of U.S. embassies, hijackings of airplanes, and the reason he wants to emulate Mughniyeh is because Mughniyeh succeeded in driving the United States out of Lebanon.
All right, Senator Shelby, you're the ranking Republican, the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the former immediate past chairman. I want to read to you a line from what William Safire, the New York Times columnist, wrote today. He said this: "The next attack will probably not be by a hijacked jet, for which we will belatedly prepare. More likely, it will be a terrorist-purchased nuclear missile or a barrel of deadly germs dumped in a city's reservoir." That's pretty alarming kind of stuff. Is it far-fetched?
I don't think anything's far-fetched. We've been trying to prepare for weapons of mass destruction. On the Intelligence Committee, I, Senator Graham, and others have tried to alert the American people to that. We have training to deal with terrorists now, the first responder program, people that would destroy our water supplies, do other things. I think it would probably come in a chemical attack first, but that's just my hunch.
Director Woolsey, yesterday I spoke to Paul Bremer, former State Department and ambassador for counterterrorism. He made the point that in 1995, the CIA effectively stopped recruiting agents in some of these terrorist cells, perhaps out of concern that Congress wouldn't like the fact that they were putting on the U.S. government's payroll some sordid, very nasty figures, and that could have undermined human intelligence gathering capabilities by the United States. Is that a fair point he makes?
Jerry and I very much agree on that. He chaired the Commission on Terrorism that I served on. This is some guidelines that were put out a few months after I stepped down as director. They grew out of the Jennifer Harbury Bamako mess in Guatemala. And the upshot is that the CIA has guidelines now that don't block it from recruiting people with violent backgrounds as spies, but they do somewhat deter it and inhibit it. And, there are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments who want to work for the United States, and that might be one way that is one way we get spies who help us in governments. But inside bin Laden's organization, or Hezbollah, there are only people who want to be human rights violators. So if you don't recruit human rights violators, you don't recruit people inside terrorist organizations. And I think Jerry is on the right track with that. I think those guidelines, particularly with respect to terrorist recruitments, ought to be changed.
So by all accounts, therefore, Larry Johnson, would you characterize this failure, this is an intelligence failure, these 4 attacks, these 4 hijackings yesterday, and the devastation that resulted from them?
In one sense, but this is not to assign blame. What really is going on here is the CIA is set up and structured much like the U.S. cavalry was before World War II. Horses had no place in World War II, yet it was still a part of the Army. And unfortunately, most of our intelligence apparatus overseas is structured to still deal with the Cold War. And there have been efforts to change it. But, and again, I'm basing this upon, I've got several friends who are in senior positions as case officers. The morale is terrible. There is a risk-averse culture, and Director Woolsey put his finger on it. These folks are just not able to penetrate what they need to, because we as this country, we can't decide whether we want to kill the rats who are in the sewer, but we don't want to get into the sewer. So therefore, we want to stay out of the sewer, but we want the rats dead, and we've got to make a choice at some point.
Senator Shelby, you'll have the last word. How do you resolve that dilemma that Larry Johnson and Director Woolsey just spoke about?
Well, I think we're going to have to beef up all aspects and change a lot of the structure and the environment in our intelligence agency. We've been talking about that. I want to talk about just 1 second. I believe it was not a success yesterday for our intelligence agencies. If it was not a success, it was a failure. Now, I'm not here to put blame on anybody, because there have been many successes, but we have to start with where we are. We had a terrible situation yesterday. We will have it again unless we eradicate terrorism. We got to do it. We can do it, but only with resolve.
Okay, I want to thank all 3 of you, Jim Woolsey, Larry Johnson, Senator Shelby. Thanks for your insight on these remarkable hours as they go by. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And updating once again the latest developments at this hour. A 54-story building across the street from New York's World Trade Center has partially collapsed. Rescue crews working in the ruins of the Twin Towers were evacuated before the building at One Liberty Plaza began to fall. 9 people have been pulled alive from the rubble of yesterday's attack. While some workers were back on the job at the Pentagon today, fire and rescue crews are finding it tough to make much headway in still smoldering ruins. One way the country is reacting to the devastation and horrific casualties is through prayer. There was a gathering in Dallas today, and a vigil has been underway at the U.S. Capitol. The investigation into the attacks has led authorities to several parts of the United States. Boston, where 2 of the hijacked planes originated, has been a focus of their efforts. A number of people have been detained for questioning. Greta?
Well, for some more insight into the massive task investigators are facing, we're joined by Bill Hinshaw at CNN Center in Atlanta. He's a former special agent with the FBI and a veteran of many bombing and hijacking investigations. And from New York, former City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly. Welcome to both of you. Bill, first to you. How do you get knives and box cutters on airplanes? In fact, on 4 different airplanes within about an hour and a half.
Well, I think it's pretty well planned, and it's relatively easy, or was relatively easy, because I think the focus of the interdiction was against weapons and explosives, and not against knives or screwdrivers or box cutters.
But you know, Bill, you still got to get through security, and every time I go through security, I go through, my body goes through the metal detector, and my carry-on baggage goes through the machine. Isn't anybody looking?
I've gotten on the plane with Swiss Army knives. I've got on the last flight I was on was behind a guy that had a toolbox that had a number of fancy-looking tools, but among them was a box cutter and several long screwdrivers. So I think the whole focus was not on what the hijackers used.
Ray, do you think the questions, have you packed your own bags and have your luggage been with you since you packed them? Are those questions simply of no value?
Yeah, I think they're of no value. I think they're silly. If you remember when we first started these magnetometers and checking people in, we used law enforcement personnel to do that. We've gotten away from that for a long time. We now use people who try hard, but certainly the standards are not very high. There's tremendous turnover. That's something that I believe has to change right now in the near term. It's just it's a silly exercise.
It was a pleasure. Ray, what do you make of the fact that they were able to get knives and box cutters? I mean, it wasn't simply one slip, one person. I mean, this was a plan. 4 different flights had them.
Undoubtedly, it was a plan, and I'm sure it was practiced. It was something that they just didn't do for the first time. You know, if you look at the FAA tests that they do at virtually every major airport each year, some of the failure rates are as high as 80%. So it's an area that needs to be looked at and needs to be changed radically. It's drifted so much since the 70s when we first started this these types of security checks.
You know, Bill, when I hear him say 80% failure, that apparently we've known there's an 80% failure in the security on these questions and getting weapons onto planes, I must admit I'm scandalized. I mean, is this what's been happening in our airports?
I suppose it has. That's what the tests show. But until we had an event such as this, it didn't really come to become a national event.
Ray, obviously the pilots of these planes have gone down, but there are a lot of people that may have helped these pilots commit this horrible crime. How do we find the others, the ones who may have helped a little bit and therefore are co-conspirators and just as responsible?
Well, you do the classic backtracking investigation, just what the FBI is doing now. You're checking rental car records, you're checking itinerary. I mean, we've seen it. We saw it in 1999 with Ahmad Rassam. We know that Canada is clearly an easy point of entry for people to come from places like the Middle East, get into Canada, and then come across our border. Last year, we had almost 500 million visitors into the United States. We need a much stronger border protection. We tried to get that in Congress after Ahmad Rassam came across in the millennium in 1999, and there was, quite frankly, no response. We need a much more robust examination of people coming into the United States. It hasn't changed, certainly in the last 2 years, and that was Rassam came in with 150 pounds of explosive and was headed for LAX. He was convicted. He also, by the way, pointed towards Osama bin Laden. So, I mean, more and more evidence is being accumulated that points to bin Laden as our major enemy in this area.
Bill, how easy to get into these cockpits?
Well, the last plane I was on, the cockpit door was open a good bit of the time. In the days a quarter of a century ago when we were facing the hijackings, or people were hijacking for money, they closed the cockpit door, and usually there was an armed sky marshal behind there, and nobody went in there, not even flight attendants. So,
but today, I mean, but obviously Ford did get in. Do you think it's extortion that they threaten the pilots are going to slit someone's throat or do something like that to get the pilots to open the doors?
I think they possibly could have, because my understanding is that the assumptions have always been don't do anything to make the hijackers mad. Let's get them on the ground. We'll negotiate with them, give them pizzas for passengers, and do something like that. These people obviously had an entirely different intent, and they didn't fit the profile, and we paid for it.
Ray, I've heard so often everyone say these are trained pilots, experienced pilots, and I do understand there's some reports saying that they had trained in Florida. But to fly a 757 or a 767, at least I would think, takes a significant amount of training, does it not?
Well, you know, these aircraft these days are fly-by-wire. They're computer controlled. You can get even simulator programs for computers. I think once it's up in the air, it's probably not that challenging, particularly if you've had some flight training. So I think it's probably easier than you might suspect.
What about aiming, though? They still wanted to hit targets. 3 of the planes were headed for targets.
Right, and I think obviously they had some training in that regard. But I mean, you talk to pilots, they say that it isn't that complicated. There is a lot of this, of course, is on automatic pilot. You get from one location to the other by going from point to point. You disengage that automatic pilot, then you do the aiming. Yes, it takes some training, but I'm told it doesn't take that much to be able to steer the aircraft.
Yeah. All right, Bill Henshaw, Ray Kelly, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
The effort to identify the hijackers has led investigators to Florida, where they are questioning people and executing search warrants. CNN's Susan Candiotti is in Vero Beach, Florida, with that part of the story. Susan?
Hello, Greta. Indeed, the FBI here in Florida had a very, very busy day indeed. We'll try to give you the highlights of what happened here this day and in other locations as well. First, we can report to you that the FBI indeed has leads on suspected hijackers that were involved in this terrorist attack. They are still hijackers who attended flight schools here in Florida. And at this hour, the FBI continues to look at other flight schools here in Florida. Law enforcement sources say that 2 of the suspected hijackers, at least 2 of them, lived here in Vero Beach. Two of them are brothers that lived here. One of them lived on this very street. Both are described as Saudi citizens. One of them is Adnan Bukhari. Adnan Bukhari, we have a photograph of him. He is said to be in his 40s. He is described as a commercial pilot for Saudi Arabian Airlines. Also living in Vero Beach, Bukhari's brother Amir. Both lived here with their wives and children. Now, this afternoon, we also had a chance to go inside one of their rented homes. This is the one rented by Adnan Bukhari. It was searched this day by the FBI, and according to documents left behind by agents, they seized a number of items, including a computer software, U.S. immigration papers, bank receipts, phone cards, a flight safety bag. We also saw a pilot's certificate, as well as a certificate that they had received specialized instruction on multi-engine planes. These pilots, we are told by law enforcement sources, attended Flight Safety International, a flight school here in Vero Beach. Law enforcement sources also tell CNN that the Bukhari brothers were believed to have been on one of the two flights out of Boston, one of those two flights that wound up slamming into the World Trade Center. Also, we can report to you that a car impounded in Portland, Maine, according to law enforcement authorities, was rented at Boston Logan Airport and driven to Portland, Maine. Now, the Maine State Police confirmed that two of the suspected hijackers were on a U.S. air flight out of Logan Airport, again, one of the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. The FBI also looking at two more suspected hijackers who spent some time both in Venice, Florida, as well as Coral Springs, Florida, which is located in the south. The two are Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef al-Shahi. Now, they stayed for a few days at the home of Charlie Voss in Venice, Florida, and they took courses at Hoffman Aviation. These people both had passports from the United Arab Republic. And finally, we can tell you that at this hour at FBI headquarters in Miami, the FBI is interviewing someone they described as a witness or friend or associate of the suspected hijackers. Back to you, Greta.
Susan Candiati, thank you very much. Wolf, back to you.
Thank you very much, Greta. And the investigation is also moving forward on the international front tonight. CNN's Mike Boettcher is tracking those developments. He joins us now from the CNN Center in Atlanta. What kind of leads, Mike, are you hearing about that point to Osama bin Laden?
Well, what they're doing is going back 2 years and going over all of the analysis they've had in this transformation of Al-Qaeda, which is the network run by Osama bin Laden. There are intercepts, and that has been talked about by officials in the government, SIGINT, as it's called, Signals Intelligence. But they're also going back with clues back for the last 2 years as Al-Qaeda has tried to transform itself, Wolf, trying to bring in various groups from other countries, especially from North Africa. They're taking a close look at Algerians as well, because it was an Algerian terrorist group, GIA, which tried to also perform a similar terrorist incident, ramming a hijacked airliner into the Eiffel Tower. That was unsuccessful, of course. That happened back in the mid-90s. It was thwarted. So they're casting their broad net, looking at what the information was over the past 2 years, Wolf, and they have gleaned a lot of evidence from that period.
And I know, Mike, you have a sort of a handbook that the Osama bin Laden organization, Al-Qaeda, circulated, which was intercepted. Tell us about some of the tips they have in there.
Well, this was introduced in the trial of the bombers of the African embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. It is an Al-Qaeda operations manual, and it dissects precisely small things. For example, what Susan was talking about on the air just a few moments ago, how to rent an apartment. Let me give you an example. In one section called Security Precautions Related to Apartments, it reads, providing the necessary cover for people who frequent the apartment, avoid seclusion and isolation from the population, and refraining from going to the apartment at suspicious times. And it is preferable to rent these apartments using false names appropriate cover, and non-Muslim appearance. Now, if these suspected terrorists are part of al-Qaeda, certainly this manual would have been part of the game plan, so to speak, Wolf, they would have followed.
Mike Boettcher, thank you very much. And let's get some historic perspective now on this tumultuous day and a half, the attack on America. How are we coping? What's likely ahead? Let's check in with CNN senior analyst Jeff Greenfield. He's in New York. Jeff, I was moved yesterday, Jeff, when you spoke about fear in America and how all of us probably will change our definition of that word as a result of what has happened.
I think that's right, Wolf. We have been a country blessed by two oceans, blessed by, except for the Civil War, never really having had violence on our soil, with the rare exception of Oklahoma City. I think if you were around New York today, it felt different than any other time I can remember. I took the subway down to work, as I always do. People were not just quiet, they were numb. Spoke to one of my old friends today who's a frequent world traveler, not going to Europe on his next planned trip, really uneasy about getting on an airplane. And that, I think, is the most significant question we face, whether this event really does, for a long period of time, fundamentally shake the security that we as Americans have always felt in our own country.
And there's no doubt even much more mundane matters will be rethought. For example, going up in a high-rise building. What were to happen if they rebuild the World Trade Center? A lot of people might be afraid to go up to the 90th floor.
Well, I think, in fact, that has already come up. There's this sense in New York that we must rebuild to show we will not be cowed by terrorists. That's a very noble sentiment. Who is going to want to work in that building? I myself, yesterday, Wolf, gazed a few blocks east at the Empire State Building, and for a couple of hours, I must say, I had a kind of uneasy feeling, is that the next target? And when you walk around like that, I mean, people who grew up in Europe, lived in Europe during World War II, they know what this means. But we as Americans don't know what this means. You spend a lot of time in Israel. You know they've come to, in some way, to live with that. And I do think that one of the real questions, I don't think we can possibly answer it for a long time to come, is whether there will be a long-term sense of uneasiness as for people who move around big cities, who get on an airplane, something we take for granted. I mean, Wolf, you and I both know that the biggest complaint we've had about airplanes is they never take off, and the trauma of airline travel. That seems like a relatively trivial matter right now, and I wonder whether that's going to affect, in some sense, our whole national sense that as Americans we've been protected.
And from what I hear you saying, and I certainly agree with you if I hear you right, this event will change all of our lives for perhaps forever.
I think, we are so given to overstatement in the media that I almost hesitate to put it that way, but I think you are right, Wolf. I think September 11th, 2001 is going to define an America before and after it every bit as much as December 7th, 1941 or November 22nd, 1963. I think it is not too much to say that we will not live anymore the same way we have been used to living before this event. And that is something that's it's so unusual for this country to go to it that I think we haven't begun to get our minds around what that means.
I totally agree. Jeff Greenfield in New York, thank you very much. Greta?
A war hero himself, he says his country is now at war again, saying this nation is in a state of controlled fury. He has a message for those behind the attacks. Senator John McCain joins us now live from Capitol Hill. Senator, thank you for joining us. You have said that we are at war, as well as the President of the United States earlier today said they were acts of war. Are we really at war? There's been no formal declaration, but are we at war?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt, Greta. Acts of war have been perpetrated on the United States of America by these terrorists, and they have declared war on the United States of America, and so I think it fits the criteria. Now, as far as a formal declaration of war on the part of the United States is concerned, that may be somewhat difficult in the respects that I'm not sure exactly how you do that, but I don't think there's any doubt that we are in a state of war.
In the event that we can identify the parties who have done these horrible tragedies on American soil, do you expect, or would you want the United States to declare formal war against the perpetrators?
Yes, I do, but I don't know exactly whether it fits the criteria for a declaration of war on the part of the Congress of the United States, whether it is a statement that the President and the Congress make together about The nature of this conflict that we're in is something I think we have to worry about in more of a Talmudic fashion. But what we're really talking about is that the American people need to know this is a long, hard struggle. It wouldn't be over if we got rid of Mr. bin Laden tomorrow. There are other organizations that are bent on the destruction of the United States of America. And in order for us to preserve America and our way of life, we're going to have to sacrifice American treasure and, unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps some American blood.
Senator, have you had an opportunity to speak to the President about this?
I haven't spoken directly to the President. I've spoken to literally all the other administration officials.
Senator McCain, it's Wolf Blitzer. There's a new poll that just came out, an ABC News Washington Post poll, that suggests that all Americans may have to sacrifice something else. Look at these numbers. Would you be willing to give up some of your liberties in this country in order for the government to crack down on terrorism? 66% said yes. Only 24% said no. Those numbers are obviously much higher than they were before this incident. How concerned should the American people be about having to give up some liberties to deal with terrorism?
I think the very reason why we have to do whatever is necessary to eliminate these organizations and punish the countries that are involved as well. And that's why I think the President's statement was very important about countries that harbor these people as well as the organizations themselves. But what we have to do is make sure that that there's a steadfastness of purpose, and thereby we can preserve America's liberties. Yes, there will be lifestyle changes. We'll never be the same getting on an airliner again, and there will be other security measures that need to be taken. But the best way to ensure maximum liberty for the United States of America is to remove the threat to it, because this whole threat obviously was about destroying our way of life.
And as you know, Senator McCain, some of your colleagues are proposing that Congress pass enact a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war, against whom I'm not exactly sure, but is that a good idea?
I think in theory it's not a bad idea, because I think the more steadfast and the strongest message we send is good. But as you just said, I'm not exactly sure who we declare war on. I think we could achieve the goals of making sure that the world and the American people know of our steadfastness and our seriousness, perhaps by some other kind of declaration. I just don't know exactly how mechanically it would work to declare war, because, as you said, who would it be on?
Senator, what do you make of the fact that our NATO allies have unanimously sort of joined in support of the United States? What does that mean sort of in the big picture that NATO has at least made this statement so quickly?
I think it's great credit to the President and Secretary Powell and others that have made this happen so quickly. I think it's a significant step. I think now we will recruit our Asian allies and other allies throughout the world to make basically the same pledge. I think the President is doing what his father did in 1991 at the time of the Persian Gulf War, and I think they deserve credit for what's been done in a very short period of time.
So as a practical matter, Senator, what do you expect in the next few days with all this sort of world support for the United States and at least a tremendous amount of, of anger in this country?
Well, I think we have to control the anger, for one thing. We don't want to retaliate against any American or anyone who is of Arab descent. That's not what America's all about. So we have to focus on our anger on those that deserve it, and that is these organizations and these countries. We have to continue to tell the American people that there's not going to be a quick fix. We have to continue to build alliances and partners and coalitions so that we can act in a concerted fashion. Every nation in the world is in danger if the United States is in danger. And then I think we formulate our plans to respond militarily, not ruling out any option. And so far, I think we're proceeding well, but we've got a long way to go. And of course, all of our American hearts are heavy.
Senator McCain, when President Bush says he will make no distinction between those responsible, the terrorists responsible for these actions, and those who harbor them or support them, give them some sort of protection, what does that say to you?
It says to me he's right on the mark, because these terrorist organizations would find it impossible to carry out the sophistication, the training, the operational capabilities that they have attained if they didn't have a country that would give them sanctuary and sometimes assistance. So this is an integral part of this challenge that we face, and I was very pleased to hear the President make that statement because I think it's very important.
On a personal level, Senator, how difficult or hard is it on members of the United States Senate and the House of Representatives in a situation like this when the American people at least feel so unprotected?
I think it gives us a sense of responsibility to communicate with the people and our constituents and do what we can to assure them that this, the greatest nation in the world, will remain so, and we'll do everything we can to protect them. But I also think that as your conversation with Jeff Greenfield, we've been a very fortunate nation. We've been protected by 2 oceans, and now we live in an era where all of those protections are not as valuable as they were in the past, and we still live in a very dangerous world, which is a reason why the United States of America must maintain its military preparedness.
And of course, Senator, you know, we also value our freedoms. That's why so many people want to come to this country. How do we have that balance in the future, the fear versus the freedoms that we've enjoyed so much?
First of all, we have to destroy the threat to those freedoms, and then second of all, we have to do everything in our power to protect those freedoms. Yes, there may be some changes. Maybe there's, as I said, the airline business, perhaps their borders have to be more carefully policed. There may have to be some changes, but we must be dedicated to the proposition of preserving the freedom of the American people. Otherwise, the terrorists have won, and we can't allow that.
Is there any way, though, to reconcile the changes that are obviously going to unfold in the day-to-day lives of Americans with the need to signal to the terrorists that they're not going to win, that our lives are not going to change?
Yes, well, because I think there's a real difference between perhaps waiting a half an hour to get on an airplane instead of walking on board, and really the curtailment of the fundamental freedoms and of democracy, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedoms, all of those freedoms that are the vital parts of democracy. And yes, we may have to have changes in lifestyle, but I don't think, in fact, it is our commitment. It's our solemn promise that we will preserve the liberties that made this nation so great and are exactly the reason why they want to attack us and destroy us.
Senator McCain, we only have a couple seconds left,
sure.
But can Americans stand down right now and assume that this terror operation is over with and we can go back to our day-to-day lives?
I don't know. I assume so. But we have to be vigilant and we have to be prepared, and the sooner we eradicate this threat to our nation, the more we can have a permanent sense of security, the more likely it is.
Senator John McCain, always good to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolf.
Thank you. And let's recap once again some of the latest information we have as of this minute. Search and rescue crews have evacuated the World Trade Center site after the partial collapse of another nearby building. It's One Liberty Plaza, a 54-story tower whose tenants include NASDAQ. Investigators believe they've identified some of the hijackers. Part of the probe is focusing on Florida, where several people are being questioned. Several homes were searched. New details of possible efforts to save the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. At least 2 of the passengers were able to call relatives. One passenger told his wife the men on board had voted to try to overtake the hijackers. And members of Congress held a vigil tonight on Capitol Hill. Tomorrow they're expected to approve $20 billion for the recovery and the investigation. Greta, I know you've been covering a lot of these kinds of investigations, nothing obviously as huge as this. They always say the first hours after an event like this are the most critical in collecting so-called forensic evidence that could hold up in a court of law. Is it your sense that these hours are slipping away, or are they doing the job they can do?
I don't think so, Wolf. I mean, this is a very different investigation. I don't think right now the American people or our president is necessarily looking to prosecute. I think that they have a different sort of agenda, especially when we hear words like war being thrown around in terms of, I think the government has a very different approach. They're not seeking to bring them into the courtroom, but to do something very different. Having said that, in this case, we know who was on the planes because they're the manifest, the passenger list. The more difficult problem is those who assisted or aided, anybody who sort of gave the nod, maybe a security person who might have looked the other way as they slid in with the knife. Those are the more difficult people to identify. And I don't think that it's necessary, you know, that we're going to get those people, but those people who helped are just as involved in the conspiracy to kill all these people and are just as responsible. They're the hard people to catch, and I don't think time makes a big difference.
Is it your sense, Greta, that if the U.S. government holds up some very, very stringent legal legal condition for pursuing those who may be responsible, the U.S. may wind up doing nothing?
I don't think the U.S. is going to do nothing. I mean, listening to Senator Shelby, Senator McCain, the President of the United States, I think the American government is going to do something. I don't know what it is, but I also think if given the opportunity to bring people into court, I think they will do that. And in 1996, a statute was passed, an anti-terrorism statute, in which if you are convicted under that statute, you are eligible for the death penalty. You'll be tried in federal court, and you will be eligible for the death penalty. And I suspect, with the magnitude of the destruction and tragedy, that you'll get the full force of the government against you.
And the reason that Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing, is serving a life sentence plus 200 years, didn't get the death penalty is what?
You know, I don't know. It's because the jurors decided apparently not to give them the death penalty. I don't jump in the minds of the jurors, but the one thing is that, you know, as I looked around Washington tonight, Wolf, I got to say that the city is very quiet tonight after the tragedy at the Pentagon here, but we are now facing the police presence in this city, and things may change a lot for us, at least in the short run. Wolf?
All right, Greta, and that wraps up our coverage for this special hour, but stay tuned. Larry King Live is up next here on CNN.
Larry will be talking to witnesses, aviation safety experts, terrorism experts, and lawmakers on the day after the attack on America. Good night, Wolf.
Good night, Greta. And right after Larry King, there will be a special one-hour CNN report, America Under Attack, hosted by CNN's Aaron Brown and Paul Lozano. Good night.